Welcome to the course Introduction of Machine Learning of the Brain for the autumn term 2023. This is a course that is being co-taught by Alona Fyshe and myself. This course is being taught by Alona Fyshe and me, Alex. And this short introduction is just going to go through the basics of the course, what will be involved, the papers we'll look at, and the various learning outcomes that we expect by the end of the term. So here's the course outline. We have the introduction to neuroscience on the 5th of September, followed by the visual system and CNNs. We'll have a coding workshop where we'll go through how to work with large language models, with EEG data, fMRI data, etc. Then we'll begin our language section with language models and language neuroscience, and then we'll end on our reinforcement learning section, which also has connections to decision making and planning. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, we have three main sections that we're covering. We're covering vision, language, and reinforcement learning. And these are going to be the taught, and these are the dates for the taught components that I'll teach on the basics for newcomers to the field, just to get you up into the point where we'll be able to progress forward with the paper presentations and have a lot of the baseline ideas already dealt with in the introductory sessions. And so throughout the class, each student will present one of the papers in one of the available classroom slots, and we expect that you would use 45 to 50 minutes for each presentation, and then we would follow by having a class discussion where we expect active participation in the classroom, where we will discuss both the presentation as it is being delivered by the student, but also some of the more interesting and intricate aspects of what was actually brought up in the papers as well. So our vision section, this is the set of papers that we're going to look at as well. I'll go through some of these in a second. So the first one we're going to look at is this paper here, which was really the first to highlight the link between CNN representations and predicting the neuron activity in monkey vision neurons, and setting up a lot of the first connections to establish that the representations learned by vision models are actually mappable onto the vision neurons in the monkey visual stream, showing that there is a relationship between what is learned by standard CNN models and how vision is accomplished in monkey visual cortex. We're then going to look at a human variation of this in this paper by Horikawa and Kamitani, where they apply machine learning to decode visually perceived images in fMRI, and in addition to imagined images as well, in this open class decoding framework. Then the third vision paper we're going to look at is a slightly different take on some of the ideas that will have been mentioned in the first two papers. So previous research linking the brains and CNNs were all trained in a supervised learning manner, and what will come later on is that a claim that it is this supervised learning signal that forces the representations to have the form that they do that leads to successful predictivity of neural activity in brains. But this paper argues for an opposing view. They show that models that learn in a self-supervised fashion, where you actually model the visual statistics of images and not via a supervised learning cross-entropy signal coming back down through backpropagation, that model representations learned through self-supervised system or learning systems like this successfully predict brain activity as well. And there are very other interesting aspects to what is proposed in this paper. So this paper argues a slightly different aspect of the brain's connection to functional specification, that argues that the models learn to self-segregate into subnetworks based on the images, the categories of images that come through. So we're more back in this supervised learning domain where we actually have an error signal coming down from a categorical class, and that this categorical class drives functional segregation within neural networks, and the argument is then extended also for to account for observations that we have in cognitive neuroscience, like pertaining to the fusiform face area and various other categories. The final paper in the vision section, neural population control via deep image synthesis, it goes beyond just finding the mappings between neural network responses and brain responses to the same images. Here, models are built to generate stimuli that are thought to maximize neuronal firing and because we're able to modulate increased and decreased activity, we actually have some control over the firing by specifically designing images that from training data that we're able to infer would drive or suppress neuronal firing. So we actually move from a correlational based analysis system into providing more of a causal one, where we're actually able to validate a hypothesis that if we can create stimuli that we believe using a specific model that would highly activate and suppress surrounding neurons, and this actually turns out to be the case, then that we're actually successfully modeling what the neurons are tuned to respond to. Here are the papers that we're going to look at in the language section. We're going to begin in 2014 with this Harry Potter fMRI dataset, where the researchers here looked at about 200 linguistically relevant variables and map out the whole story reading process across the brain. We're then going to look at this interesting paper on using EEG activity responses to linguistic stimuli, as well as language model representations from the same stimuli in order to develop this multimodal framework by which we could use this banded EEG signals that have been previously associated with various NLP tasks, that by including this information alongside just the images as well, we would be able to have access to a wider range of information, and models should be able to learn and perform different tasks better based on exactly what brain data we supply to the multimodal modeling framework. This paper by Shaylee Jane and Alex Huth looks at LSTM models and systematically varies the linguistic context representations and shows that areas of the brain in fMRI are differentially better modeled by either longer or short range contexts. And this is a big contribution to modeling this ongoing contextual effects, the fact that since we now had contextual representations of language, that we could extend single word representations and linking those to brain activity to finding areas of the brain that are more sensitive to various ongoing context lengths. And one other point of note about this paper is it was one of the first to look at the idea that it's not always the end layer or the top layer of a neural network that have the highest brain predictivity, but something we actually find in one of the middle layers. So before we're actually while we're able to abstract away from the inputs and the outputs of an LSTM, that the abstracted middle layer of these 3-layer LSTMs was actually most predictive of brain activity. And this is some of the future papers that we'll talk about, we'll come back to, specifically this one. So following up on the prior results, the authors here use a massive data set across both functional magnetic resonance imaging and MEG in order to examine visual, lexical and transformer, i.e. contextual responses at various high timescales, and also spatial resolution in fMRI. And so there's some nice visualizations in this paper, and the main claim shows that the middle layers are better predictors of the brain activity, like we saw in the previous paper. And as task specialization starts to take hold, alignment to brain activity drops slightly, and the main conclusion is that models that are better next word predictors have increased brain predictivity. The fifth paper on language discusses how we can actually make better NLP models with using neurolinguistic insights. So this model proposes a change to BERT-based models based on the analysis of brain data, and finds that improved performance by incorporating insights from the language neuroscience into complex NLP models actually gives a increased performance in some downstream NLP tasks. And just like in the vision case, when we move from this correlation to causation, where we devise these control stimuli in order to either drive or suppress neuronal activity in monkeys, this is a very recent preprint that shows that we can do the same thing using large language models and in human fMRI, specifically to either increase or decrease, or as they say in the paper, like to drive or suppress bold activity in response to various sentences. The final section is the reinforcement learning section, where we have these 5 papers that we're going to be looking at. So in the taught section on RL, we're going to explore the dopamine reward hypothesis and point to aspects of model-free and model-based reinforcement learning abstractions in the brain. And then this paper will go further and account for some of the error signals in the brain that we see in an fMRI task, and claim that there are 2 types of learning signals, one for model-based and one for model-free reinforcement learning, using state prediction errors along with the reward prediction errors, to argue that the intraparietal sulcus and the prefrontal cortex are variably responsible both for model-free and model-based reinforcement learning in the brain. We're then going to look at this paper, which looks at path integration and finds that the emergence of grid cell representations in neural networks using an RL-based analysis, they show how modeling the grid cells in entorhinal cortex can lead to agents that have enhanced abilities to take shortcuts in complex environments, and argue for the framing of grid cell representations to support vector-based navigation. And so the hippocampus has been modelled as a cognitive map all the way back from the 1970s in John O'Keefe's work. But then recent research has argued for the role of what's called successive representations in reinforcement learning that actually explain hippocampus not as a cognitive map, but as a predictive map. And framed in this reinforcement learning framework, the authors show that there are various interesting cases to explore and account for activity or experimental data deriving from the hippocampus. So prior accounts of the phasic dopamine activity have been within the context of striatal systems in the brain to variously explore either model-based or model-free reinforcement learning, but without an explicit account for what actually happens in the prefrontal cortex, which we've known for a long time to be destination of dopaminergic neurons in the dopamine reward system. So here they have interesting observations using these frozen LSTMs, which give rise to this meta-learning framework that's encompassed within the prefrontal cortex that can explain some of the edge cases that have been observed around current RL accounts of the dopamine reward system that haven't actually been able to be fully accommodated by those theories. And this final paper to close off the paper presentations, using deep reinforcement learning to reveal how the brain encodes abstract state representations in high-dimensional environments. So here we have this framework of 3 Atari games, and the authors explore this natural decision-making in deep Q networks, and they find that the representations of task are encoded in the dorsal visual pathway and also in posterior parietal cortex, and then they explore these computational principles that are common to both human results and also what is going on in these deep Q networks. And so after we complete the paper presentations, throughout the whole class you will have picked your own project, and we would like you to find a data set using brain activity responses of some sort, and pick a model or an assessment technique and devise your own experiments to explore the questions that interest you. You could work by yourself or work up in groups of up to 3 people. And by the end of the class, we expect that you will have completed a small research report in the style of a small journal article, describing your findings and the way that you chose to analyze your data, and including some statistics or interpretability-based techniques to assess the initial experimental questions that you had. Yeah, that is everything.